practicing forester for 62 years, my wife reminded me, and also she said that I wasn't to tell too many stories. Unfortunately, I was hoping, because she really helps out up at the center, that she'd be here, but she's under the weather. She's got a hip condition, and she doesn't get around very well. And I will tell a story on her since she's not here. I couldn't figure out, because in the house she uses a walker. But if you get her out in public, and I get her out of the truck, she goes grocery shopping with me, and it takes a while, you know, when you get older. I finally figured out that's what she used that cart for, the grocery cart. But she tells me where I'm supposed to go. So I get a lot of exercise when we go grocery shopping. With that, I had a few breaks along the way. Before that, I got that because Uncle Sam got a hold of me, and then back during the Vietnam War, I didn't have enough sense to get out of the service when I stayed in the reserve. I got called back in during the Vietnam War, so I had a couple of breaks there, but the rest of the time I practiced forestry, and I had a year to get, I went back and got my engineering degree, logging engineering degree from the U. And in those days you could just about follow up, and at the time, if I'd have been smart and not too proud, I'd have gone to the U to get my forestry degree, but somebody offered me a scholarship to play football, and it was a small school, so I needed the money. The GI Bill didn't cover too much. With that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history. So let's start off. Does anybody recognize this picture? I hope not.
Yeah, right.
But this is NookChat Camp, and it was out in this location someplace. I'm not quite sure. If anybody knows, I'd appreciate it. And anytime you have a comment or a question, please come in. Come on in.
You mean camp? Camp for what?
This is the logging camp.
Oh, logging camp, we'll say.
And
What year?
pardon?
What year?
That would be after 1900, right about that time. Because I'll tell you, the next picture, Jim, down there, so again, that picture right there, you got that? But this picture here is a picture of, if anybody recognizes it, that old bridge right there.
Oh, yeah.
This is Everson, and that's a log train.
Oh, yeah.
And what happened up at NookChat Camp, and it was in that period of time, they had 30 million board feet, and they got the railroad to Sumas in 1900. And it goes right through Everson, went up, and went to Sumas in 1900. In 1903, they got it to Maple Falls. In 1905, they got it to Glacier. And so, but that was the Bellingham Bay in British Columbia. I have a book here that's called The Railroads of Whatcom County. And if anybody's interested, as we close up here and you want to take a look, I can show you what the right-of-way looks like, all the way from Bellingham up to. There's not. I think there's very little grade ever left that you could identify from, at least that part. Once you get to Sumas, going up the canyon, then there's a lot of grade you can see up there. And this picture right here is Everson, and Jim was telling me it has to be 1914 because the school is there, and that's when they built the school. Could you show that to them up there?
Mm-hmm. I'll send this one around, Paul.
Okay.
How we doing? Making it tough?
Yeah, we got this one.
And I threw this one in because it's a rather, we have a stump puller, well, they have two types. We've got the black powder spuds, and then where you bored them and shot them, and then there was the one that had to take a mule or an old horse and you cranked it around until you could break the stump. And then this one, and what you did, it's upon a pulley, and this ring down here, and they'd pull them. And this was quite common, and I told Jim and the rest of you, I'm not possible, I might be the 500-year-old man, but I would have surely loved to see this place about 1800, because it couldn't be anything but big trees and then that big mountain up there. So, well, if you'd have been a little earlier even, I guess the last time we had a lot of smoke coming out of Baker, not the last time, but one of the erupting times was sometime in the 1700s, according to Don Easterbrook, that it erupted back in the late 1700s. But I put that in there as a little thing because a friend of mine said, you know, he's a tree farmer, and his dad got into tree business, but before, when they were younger, they lived down here in the valley, and he and his brothers always were told, go get those trees and get them out of there. They're taking grass away from the cows. It changes it depends on where you are, and I guess that we all. I'm proud of the fact that I've got one tree person in the family. My daughter teaches arboriculture at Boise State University. She's a professor of arboriculture, and and horticulture also. But one of the best compliments I think I've ever got, I was in Boise where she lives, and I was in the mall down there, and some fellow come up, he really surprised me. I had a old pinstripe shirt and can't bust 'ems and the braces and everything, and he come up and he said, you're one of those tree killers. Boy, he really backed me up and about that, and then I started getting huffy but my daughter stepped in and said, excuse me, that's my dad. And he's a tree hugger. and the guy looked and he says, yeah, you ought to realize that. I don't know how many, but I'll bet he's cut 1 million down. But you know something? He's planted 5 million, and they're growing, and he knows every one of them by name. Now, I call him a real tree hugger. That'll be one of my last stories, but that I was always thought that was pretty cool. Yeah. She jumped right in there. Now, I got some more pictures here I tried to get them as local as possible. That first one there is linden. And this is right after 1900, but they oxen, and they've got that cordwood, and that's actually it'd be a bog, really, and they've shored it up, and the oxen are skidding that down there. Up at the center, if you haven't been there, I have a big picture up there of the oxen in Linden, and there's a fellow there, he's got a grease bucket and a branch and a brush, and he's coating the cordwood. And what he's doing, and his name was the Grease Monkey. That's what he did, and he greased the skids for the oxen to pull.
Can you show where the skids would be greased?
And in this one right here, he'd be right behind that team right there. He'd be out there, right here in front of that first log. That's where they put it down.
Did they have to grease before the end of the log?
Yes, right at the tip is where he kept putting it down. And he'd get in there and get a real quick swipe in between, as I understand. And that's why you see some of these pulls, and they've got a little distance sometimes. Right there, they've got some together in that particular picture. Next one there is, this is Deming in 1952. And there was, I think, 13. I have to look down. 13 truck caravan. One log dug fir.
One tree.
One log. Yeah,
one
that's the
log.
butt. Most of those are butt cuts, so
Yeah.
you can see the swell on them. This one isn't too local, but I couldn't. I really had to talk about it because that's one of my favorite pictures. That lady, and those are all cants that have been sawn out. We'll pass these around, and she's standing right in there. When you get a chance to look at it, you can see when it's small. We'll start over here this way.
The squares are beat out logs.
Yeah, they're from logs. And just take and consider her size, and then look at the size of the cants. And this one, we're getting a little further away from home, but this is down around Tacoma, and this Bermuda Spar Company, that's where they were. And this was the Pacific Mutual Door Company, and the longest spar that they had produced. And being a logger, I couldn't refuse this one, because this one is something really unusual. You got a single spar, and it's double rigged. They're loading with one donkey and yarding with the other one. It's really unusual to see that. Follow up real quick here. I'll take the first one, Jim. Well, I'll let you do it, but they might be hard to separate. But this one here is, this is anybody driving up when you get to Kendall and you're going up the road and you look off to your right, that's Slide Mountain up there. And this camp is Chin Camp. And this is looking down at the North Fork of the NookChat. And you can look over here on the hill on Sumas Mountain, and that would be the Belport Quarry. And the railroad is just coming around here, so this is sometime after 1903. And there, this is the camp. You can see the camp down here. And this is looking down on the NookChat. And here's the picture down below. Is that's the camp up close, and with the crew, the whole crew out there. And this, in those days, it took a lot of manpower for this type of thing. And so, I guess when I made a mistake here, I could see that. One more, and then I wanted this one next after that one. So, that one right there, this is at right around some of the area before they fell up on Slide Mountain. And that's the Douglas fir. And this is the kitchen crew here, standing by this big fir tree. And if you can imagine the size of that thing, with that's a pretty good fir there. And there are not too many limbs on that big.
How far up did you have to go to the first limb on?
Well, I've got a story I'm going to tell a little later on, but
Okay.
I've seen it been 80 feet, a lot of times, maybe more,
To the first limb?
to the first limb. Now, this one, this is called an incline. And this is in Maple Falls, and this came down right, and then crossed the river, and when it came over and tied into the main spur, was right where Silver Lake Road is now. The railroad came up from the river and crossed, and there was a trestle that went on out to the east, going up the canyon. But this came down off the mountain. And they took the engine up there, and then the log cars were loaded up and down. And we have,
So it was used to take the timber off the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill?
right. And until 1927, the town of Maple Falls was a pretty good sized town, but in 1927 it burned to the ground. The whole town did. So,
How did they get it up there?
Fires had several effects.
Excuse me, how did they get it up there to the top of the hill?
They pulled up the track.
here,
But
right.
with, I was gonna say,
Okay,
but
so
with-
here we have, here is this particular engine here. This, let's see, gotta make sure I got the right one here. No, I gotta get it, I might have plugged this up a little bit. This is the engine, it's called a road engine. And this was the one that pulled the things up and down.
Did it have it went on the track then?
It went on the track.
so
this
what
one-
type-
it
What
was-
type of a grade was it then?
Well-
I mean, because I saw
What kind
it,
of
and
grade?
so what kind of a grade were you looking
Oh,
at to get that up?
Probably between 30 and 40%.
Wow.
It was steep grade.
It's deep, yeah. But you took advantage of it because you didn't use as much, you didn't need as much brakes to hold everything back coming down, but you didn't have the big pull going up either. And of course, those donkeys, they had tremendous power, and the the way they spooled that rope on there. That wire was probably 2 1/4.
And why'd they call them donkeys?
Donkeys? Yeah, well, that's what they did. They went out and
It took the place of a 4-footed donkey.
yeah, the 2-footed one too. And this is just, let's see. I wanted to make sure I had that. And here's, this is just another setting, and this is the rigging here on this. And there actually, if you look real close, and I won't get too technical, but anybody know what I mean, this was a gravity feed here. They were using gravity to slow this one. You didn't see that too much in this day and age here. This one is, you can see the track just in the bottom, but there's the road engine sitting right there. And they pulled them up and then they turn them around. And the segments of the car, there's 2 sets of tracks that they used, and then they put the logs in between, strapped them down, and that's what held the load together and kept the separation between the wheels, and that's what they pull up and down on those. Those weren't, you wouldn't see them going down the main line. And the other thing that was unusual around here, it was very uncommon. There was not a lot of narrow gauge. In fact, very little. It was all standard gauge, and the rail was 16 pounds to the foot. And what they did is, because then if you had to transfer the engine or some of the equipment, they had flat cars that they could put it on. You didn't have to switch around and use a different engine and wait for things to change. You could take your logging engine, of which there were 4 different kinds. You had a Heisler, and you had the Willamette, and the Shea, and the Climax. Those were the 4 primarily produced. The Willamette was produced in Portland. The Heisler was built back east, and so was the Shea, but there were some that under a copyright deal that were built in Seattle, Washington, especially the Heisler. And the difference, and I can remember this, when I was working in the woods when I was going to school, and before, when I got out of the Army, what they did was they made sure that the rail, and that's the way they put them together, to where they didn't have to do all this shifting around, and it made a big difference. And you got to realize a lot of this country, especially the lowlands and back up, was all logged with the railroad. And I have a separate thing here before I get into that, right out here and up in the Columbia Valley, from where Cultus Lake comes down to where where has everybody been on Silver Lake, where you go up South Pass and then it turns into Silver Lake Road right there in the old Boundary House, and there was a barn out there and it had American flag on it, and it burned down here about, I can't remember, several years ago now. But I know I get a lot of stories from the Hellers up there, because they grew up on a homestead right close by there, and that border didn't mean anything. They were back and forth. But in 1919, in the Columbia Valley, on the Canadian side, the Columbia Falls, or Columbia Logging Company, they set a world record. They put in one shift, they put 100 cars, loaded 100 cars with logs in one shift. Now, in those days, the shift was probably 12 hours, but in one shift, they put up 100 cars. There's also, down on the South Fork, there was another camp down there, and they put out 100 cars, but I never can find out what year they did that. I'm not sure. And this one is the modern. If we had to worry about homeless shelters, we just don't have any big. We don't have any big cedar stumps. I don't mean to make it light, but at the same time, have to think about it, because they did. The people lived in them.
Steve would tell you about that, can't you?
Yeah. Yeah, we have one on our place.
Steve had, the homesteader on his place lived in a log house.
Oh, yeah.
It's still
stump.
there.
The stump house. Oh, is it?
Oh, yeah.
Ah, good.
They'd make a great espresso stand.
Okay. Any questions so far, or comments, or how we doing
So when did they start logging in the area?
in the area? Well, I was asking Tom here, and he said that when was it? 1888, and they actually, you know, they started back. 1855, 1857.
I mean, I'm
Right
sure
in
the
that-
homesteaders had logged some, because I know the guy that homesteaded ours in 1870, 71.
Now this is 1852,
Yeah, so,
so that was pretty close. And it went, you know, pretty well down there in Bellingham. There was a mill, and they had that. I have a picture, but I'm a little fussy about it because it's pretty hard to get an original Kinsey, not a print, but original picture.
I have a few.
And I do too, and I watch them.
Because I was looking at him going, oh, I don't see very many of these, because he was my grandma's uncle.
Oh, was he? And he is buried right up here
Yep.
in the NookChat cemetery, and so is his wife.
Yeah.
She was the super. She's the guy.
She always the one that wore the gloves, because
Yeah.
her hands were
Yep.
stained.
Stained from the film, but he was just he had a real knack for it, and he had real ties to the industry. He got right in with them, and I think it was 2 bits or 50 cents, and he'd take your picture, or he'd take the whole group for $5 for the whole day.
And he'd come back the day they were paid, so
Yep.
he could get paid.
Yeah.
for the pictures.
Yeah, always got there on payday.
Oh, yeah.
Is that how he got them all in one picture? Because those huge pictures where he has the whole crew, it's like, did they take the whole day off just for the picture?
No.
Because I know it took him
No.
forever to set
No,
up.
he'd
No.
take his horses up there and,
They'd probably be like, maybe they worked a half a day on Saturday, and he'd get there and take the picture when they were all, before they headed to town, or if they even got to town.
right.
But that would be, if they were close in.
Okay.
I worked for Simpson, and I lived in the camp at Griswold, and when we were logging on the Wynoochee before they built the dam, and that was back in, 53, 54. And I know Jerry Hammer up the road here. One time we were joking around, and he said, yeah, I was at Grisdale. And I said, oh, but he was there a little later than I was. But, yeah. And then the other thing about the mills here, the big mill here was located back up. We were just talking about that with Glen Echo was the name of the company. It was a shake mill and a sawmill. And there was a mill right where Great Western is now. And the Millman family, we just got it, and it was, I have it here. Well, I've got it in the book here at 62, and Tom said it was probably 52 when they bought the mill. And he said that the 3 people listed here, one was Jerry's dad, who now has the mill, and his uncle and his granddad. Yeah, was the names listed in here. So. And then there was of course, we still, Alpine was Jerry's outfit before, and then became Alert, and Bill, Tom's brother, is now has Alert, and then Ingholm's here in town, and there's several other, people, hauler, log truckers, and then Everson over here, lumber down here. But at one time in Whatcom County there was 157 sawmills, and that didn't count the shake mills. 157 of them. And today we have 2, and the rest are all remanufacturing. They've been canted down, or they've got portions, or like over here in Sumas, they're making cedar siding, beveled siding. So they bring the cedar down and then they bevel it down. I understand that the broker there, they're talking about having some kind of remanufacturing facility there. Probably has something to do with the tariff back and forth. We're always fighting that battle. That's part of it. Yes, sir.
I've got a small piece of ground on the Noon Road, and it's a remnant of my great-grandfather's homestead that he homesteaded in the 1880s. But I've always heard that there was, that the Noon Road was named after a sawmill. Do you know anything about a Noon sawmill or a sawmill on the Noon Road? And I think somebody told me once that they thought it was near the Mount Baker Highway. But does that ring any bells with you?
Not with me right now, but I was thinking at Tom, because I don't, but I have a book, and it's one the library has this particular thing, and it's all the manufacturing companies from 1852 to 2005 are in this book. But and I'll, when we get a minute here, remind me, and
Well, a
we'll.
little bit of information I have heard about it is that it was probably in late 1800s or early 1900s, but
It'd have
I
to
really
be.
haven't found anything.
It'd have to be, because they weren't getting that far in. How many of you have been up to the center? Okay, so, and Jim has. What I'd like to do is say, please come up. We're open from Memorial Day to Labor Day on the weekends. And we usually got a lot of work to do, so we're there. And if the gate's open, we're there. We can always stop. There's a lot of maintenance to do, but you should come and take a look, because we've also got a lot of pictures and stuff like that. And I know that Lee Williamson told me before he passed away, and Joe Zender used to say the same thing, that it used to be every milepost there was a shake mill. And there's a possibility that mill on Noon Road was a shake mill. That's just a possibility that it was a shake mill, because there was a lot of cedar right along there.
Oh, yeah, on my piece of ground.
There's still cedar
There's
there?
a cedar stump that it would take at least 6 people with their arms out to encircle.
Yeah.
That's hollow in the middle, and
Okay.
about 20 feet high.
20 feet high, yeah.
Yeah.
So there was, and every milepost, there was a cedar mill. And up at the center there, we built a sawmill. Mike Imperial, anybody know Mike? He wrote several books about the mining and everything up here, and he owned the Imperial Construction. And he, when he gets talking about back in the stories and the trees and stuff like that, his grandfather was Pat Imperial. And on the Silver Lake Road, as you're going toward Silver Lake Park from Maple Falls, where you come, the Darnenballs own that property now. Jerry, he passed away now, but Heidi still lives in the new house. And the old Imperial house has moved down, and a lady by the name of Thomas, put that house just on the edge there by Buckenmeyer's, right on the edge of town as you come around before the hill where Cliff LeBounty up on the hill there is, right there. And it's pretty interesting that you can see that. But I was also, right there was where the dam was, and the Wright Shingle Company, and I have a picture, that was the mill pond. That meadow out there was the mill pond, and I have a picture with all the shake bolts floating in there, because it was a saying, they were all floating in that mill pond, and it was full. And the other one, I got quite a kick out of it when everybody was talking about the Lake Whatcom, and I have a picture, and I think it was taken by Kinsey, I'm not sure, but it's about 1905, and the only trees in the Lake Whatcom area are floating in the lake. Because you can see the hills in the background, and there isn't anything. Of course, that big mill set right there, and
Right,
Odell Donovan.
Oh, the Blue Odell Donovan,
Yeah.
right, yeah. Back in the-
And then I also remember coming here and ran into a fellow, and he was telling me years before, it was Rick Dawson, but some of his family, he grew up there up on the hill there, right above there, and there used to be an amusement park there.
Yeah.
And he was telling me about that was there. And then, of course, the way they came from South Valley down Wickersham, and then the ferry ran across And then the railroad went up around the North Shore,
Yeah.
went through there.
Phil, you mentioned that you'd be willing to conduct tours midweek if somebody wants to get a group together.
Yeah, if you wanted to get a group together and let me know in advance so we could work something out, we could take a tour. The only thing we have to do early in the year is, number two, I have to make sure the operations that we can be able to go through, but we could go up on the mountain. And the other thing is the road conditions. And we take tours up on the mountain. It takes about 2 hours. We go up and do. Up until 2006, we always, every year, with Black Mountain Forestry Center, we had a thing called WOW, or the World of Wood. I don't know if anybody ever went to one, but it was a pretty good show. We had one time there at the house, the Gerdrum House, and the thing, we had over 2,500 people there over a 2-day weekend. It was, yeah, I can remember, it always take me 2 weeks to get over it.
What do they see when they go up on the mountain?
Well, every different kind of forest practice that we're within the Douglas fir type and the hemlock. We talk about what the succession is of the plants as they grow and how they are, and we talk a little bit about seed collection and seed zones and aspect and elevation, and the other thing we talk about road construction, and that way, and they've got some pretty good examples up there. And we also say, well, if you never made a mistake, it's like my dad always used to tell me, if you never made a mistake, you've never had the opportunity to do something, or you're lying, one or the other. So don't lie. So, and there's a few mistakes up there that we talk about. Yes, sir.
How much money did you make?
How much money do I make?
Or did you make when you were logging?
Well, there were some years that were good, and then there were some years that were bad. So I owned PNC Logging with a partner, and we did pretty good. Today, in the woods, I know several people. We have loggers still, and today, to stay in the business, you got to be really good at it. Tom's brother Ed, you know, he was a cutter and a half. In fact, Mike Impero and I were up there, and we had a group of people, we were talking, and we were looking across Canyon Creek. And Mike pointed out, he says, no, it was Dan Kohler, said, yeah, I think Ed Westergreen, he was the flower on, when they fell that it was a Forest Service sale. I can't even remember who logged it. But, and it was a thinning, commercial thinning, and you can still see the roads in there, but all of it, and it's really grown up since they logged that and took some of the larger trees. It was from above, but and it was steep. There was some steep ground back in there. I always joke around and say I took my PhD in steep ground in the Wynoochee. I got out of the Army and I told my folks, I said, I mustered out at Fort Lawton. This was 1953, and I said, I can't come home. I'm going to go to work. I've got a job, I think. Send my hard hat, my cork boots, and my lunchbox. And I went to Simpson and walked into the head, and they always had a grumpy old guy in there, usually the bookkeeper. And he looked at me and he says, what do you need? And I said, I need a job. I just got out of the Army. He says, yeah, you look like it. He says, okay. He said, let me see those boots. And I showed him. And he said, well, you're going to have to do something about those corks. He said, at least you've used them. And then he said, you got lunch? And I said, yeah. And he said, the hard hat, let me see that. And he looked at it and he said, you see that big guy standing out there by that crummy? He said, you go out there and tell him you're hired. And I walked out. I was later really good friends with the guy. He was an old Swede. He said, get in the bus. And went and he says, you're my new gopher. And I thought, damn it, I come here to work in the woods, not gopher. And to me, my son, when he was growing up, he gophered. Because until he was old enough to get out there, you went and you bought parts and you run and you chased in a pickup truck and all that. But to me, I thought even then, that was not what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in the woods. And we got up there and we got out of the bus, and he said, "Son," he said, "you just run over to see that guy standing over there." It was in the other bus. He said, "You go with him." And I walked across the landing, and he said, "Where's your lunchbox?" And I said, "Right here." He said, "Good. Put that hat on." I slapped that hard hat on, and he said, "Okay, down over the hill." And down over the hill we went. And got down, and he said, "Now we get down to the bottom." And this is a good story even, because the chokers were big. Knob and bell, but they were big. And he says, "Okay, here's how it works." And he was showing me, and it's fine. And I grew up over in eastern Washington, and I'd been in the woods since, I don't know, we had quite a bit of trees on the ranch, and I was always out there, and we had nice trees. But this was the first impoundment I think they ever cleared the impoundment before they built the dam. And they were logging it all out there. It was just, and they had the job of taking it down. Simpson did. And we got down there, and he said, "Okay," he said, "did anybody tell you what this job is?" I said, "Well, they told me I'm a gopher." And he said, "Now you're going to find out." And he punched the whistle, and they took up the slack on that line. And he said, "Go for a hole." And we went for a hole, and then the stumps and the rocks and everything else come down. And when everything quit rolling, you got out and you started setting choke again. Next turn went up the hill. And it was a good summer. Keep you in shape. They feed you good, and it was a good company to work for. But Grays Harbor was nothing but board sidewalks. And Saturday, we got off at noon. We worked a half a day, and then you went to town. And yeah, it was fun. I didn't lose all my teeth then. It came later. That was, but I always said I really got a lot of experience, and it really helped later on. And worked in the rigging and went on. And I did one more quick story about that was I got out one day, and we were rigging another spar, and we didn't have towers. We were using settings, and we had to build the road to fix that. And the Bureau of Reclamation, I think, or Corps of Engineers, they had more government brass out there telling us how to do this, and the Forest Service was there. And so we got out, and Swede, my boss, said, "Hey, Phil, come here." And he says, "I want you to take this truck." And I look over there, and here's the truck driver is just sick. And he's really sick. He says, "And we got to send him down the mountain, but we got to get this load down there." And he says, "I want you to drive that truck." I said, "Hell, I don't want to drive that truck." And he said, "Do you know how to drive a truck?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "That's what I thought. Get in the damn truck. I'm going to tell you two things." He said, "This was my training to be a log truck driver. And if you'd ever come down off the top around the high water mark and down to Wainuchi, down to the camp, there's quite a grade that comes off that hill." And he says, two things. He says, and these are water-cooled brakes. He says, if you got white, just keep your foot off the brake. Take it easy. Gear it down. And these were gas pods. And they weren't diesel rigs. These were gas. And the second one was, if it's black, jump. I made it to the bottom, and I got down, and he come down that night, and I guess that was on a Friday night, but the next day we went to town. And he says, "Come on." I said, "Where are we going?" He says, "I'm going to buy you a beer." I said, "Boy, that's really a good raise in pay for driving truck." He says, "Shut up and drink your beer." but he thought that was all right. I got to the bottom of the hill without wrecking the truck. things we changed over the years, but there are some good memories around some of this. And,
In the earlier logging, were you doing any replanting?
all of it.
Everything was replanted.
Yeah. Didn't. In doing all this practicing, while we were trying to make ends meet when we had the logging company we were starting out, I was part of a partnership I'd been a smoke jumper years ago for the Forest Service. After this episode with Simpson and I, well, the money was good, so it was interesting from the standpoint of, well, I lost my train of thought now. What was it?
You're talking about replanting?
Yeah, replanting. That what it was is that we always, everything, even before the Forest Practices Act, I think that there was a real effort, and that was in 1972, was the first Forest Practices Act in the state of Washington. But there was always a reforestation effort going on. And I later, when I got my professional degree and then my logging engineering degree, I was an intern for Weyerhaeuser, and I went to work for them. And they always told the story. That's where I got it. We were looking at that plaque there that we got up at the Forester Center. It's Weyerhaeuser Dinkman Company back in Wisconsin. And they said, the old man George, they always told, and this was in the 50s, old man George, when he finally cut all the timber all the way and he got to the Pacific Ocean and he found out he couldn't grow trees in salt water, they started planting trees. that was the story of the Weyerhaeuser Company. But reforestation has always been an effort. And I always, we put on a 5th grade conservation tour, us and several other members, DNR, Foreign Foresters, and the Forest Service, Sierra Pacific, Weyerhaeuser. We're going to have Public Works is going to do one this year, going to be part of it. The Forest Service, the DNR, and we have then a reforestation section, and we also have a tree identification section for the 5th grade classes. And we do, Black Mountain Forestry Center does timber products or harvest. And we have that program. And I always, when I'm talking to the class, one of the things I always ask the people, I say, who here thinks it's a bad thing to cut a tree? And I put up my hand. Everybody looks around, and even some of the teachers look at me, and I said, if you don't replace it. That's what makes it all right to cut the tree. And because we have been that way, and back in 1928, the Forest Service, or Congress, passed a bill that required on the Forest Service lands and the O&C lands down in Oregon and California on the railroad right-of-way grants that had been consolidated, they were required to reforest. And this, because of this, and over the years, that this was always replacing what you took. And the old ratios used to be about 1 in 5. That was fairly standard. It was that way for a long time. Today, we're way below that, about 1, 2.5, because of the success of the plantations now, because of the refinement we've made in identifying species, what we're putting on the land, and the elevation, the aspect, and everything else, and then the seed source. We're trying to get, there's a lot of effort that's gone into making sure that the seed source is available to the area where you took it off. And our plantations are really successful. If you want to take a look at some good ones, go up and look at Tom's place. There's a lot of good ones up there. They do a heck of a job of putting them back on there. And it was a little different over home. I grew up south of Colville in a little town of Chewelah. Valley is the town where I grew up, and up in the headwaters of Colville River, my family, we have a place up there and got a fairly large timber holding. And I always think when they had those big fires over there about 5 years ago, one of the reasons we never had any problems was because we religiously underburn. And that the species over there are western larch, which is the tree that looks like it's dying every fall and the needles fall off of it. It's a deciduous conifer, basically. And Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. The Doug fir, they're small cousins to what's around here. They're, but it's still pretty nice timber. But the pine is exceptional, and the larch is really good. My grandfather built barns down back there in the early 1900s, and there's 2 barns there that are still just as solid as a dime, big hay barns that were. But the timber, we do a little different method. The silviculture is slightly different. It's called uneven age management, or all age management. And well, since the 1950s, my uncle, my Uncle Clarence, he's actually my dad's uncle, but he's the one that got me started out there. And my dad said one time he knew he'd lost me as far as keeping me on the ranch, because he knew damn well I'd start chasing those trees someplace. And I said, like I told him, I never disappointed, did I? But that was, and I think it goes to help people understand, and that I get down to what the mission of Black Mountain Forestry Center is that we're to educate and talk about what the real values we have from this. And the other point, due to all this reforestation effort, when you ask about planting and reforestation, we're the only nation in the world that grows more timber today on less acres than we did 100 years ago. The only nation in the world. And the one that's got the biggest deficit right now is Russia, because they're going through it fast. Out in the Siberian spruce types and that subarctic, it would almost be, they're really taking it out of there. But they do. They have a lot of similar problems with what we have from the standpoint of wildfire. Yes.
What is the reasoning behind not doing anything like on Highway 20, going over the pass, that you see all the dead, from the beetles or whatever they are? Why won't they do something about that?
Good question. Okay, we've got two things that play into there. We have, under the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Forest Service. And at one time, they were a multiple use agency. At one time. I'll qualify this because they're not anymore. And the second thing, as you go, you have the National Park Service. And that was created in the 1960s. And we had a U.S. senator at that time. And there's a bust of him up there on the overlook over the thing. And he told a group of us that this would be the last encroachment we made for reducing the acres of commercial forest land. The Park Service is a preservation-oriented organization, and they really are fantastic from the standpoint, in 1912, they were charged with the preservation of the nation's jewels, and I think they've really done a nice job. The one thing that they've had to contend with is one of the jewels that they inherited were some vast forest lands. And forest lands are just like human beings. They don't last forever. And you get into a problem with avalanches and fire and insects and everything else, you lose that. And if you're not in the business of harvest, there's no way to do it. The other thing, since 1992, we haven't really, well, last count I had, I think last spring on the timber tour, the Forest Service had said that they were, and there was some discussion over this, but only about, I think something like less than 6 million board feet on the Mount Baker's Snoqualmie National Forest in the last 25 years. It's almost, and that's why you see a lot of this on land that, not all of that land is harvestable, but most of it is park when you get up on top. But when you break over from Washington Pass, when you get down the other side, then you better start looking at what your management has been, because that's where we've really taken it. And one of these days, it's going to catch fire. We had a big one right over the ridge 3 years ago in the Pasayten Wilderness. But the wilderness also, as part of our management scheme of our federal lands, it has a place. But the other thing, when we look at, we were talking the other night, and from the standpoint of this company that we had, and I had some contacts with the industry because of Weyerhaeuser and a few others, and up in Canada we were across the line because in those days the Forest Service had or the BLM or any of the Park Service, they didn't hire contractors. And of course BC Forest Service the Northwest Territory and the Yukon, they hired contractors. And since this company was started, 4 of us were old smoke jumper buddies, and we started it, and foresters. And we started this company, and we called it IFAS, International Forest Fire Systems. And we contracted in the Northwest Territory and the Yukon. We did smoke jumping for those, primarily because they had those large fires and they had a lot of Indian settlements around the large lakes. And we would go in and jump, and we would protect those settlements. And a little hard to do sometimes, but we were pretty successful with a 10-man crew. At least you keep the town from burning down, type of thing. But the other thing I found out was that was in the 1960s and 70s. The ground all of a sudden got harder. Parachutes were better, but the ground was harder. So, and in BC, we had a helicopter repelling program. And if you've ever gone over the Transcanada Highway at the town of Revelstoke, back in where they built the dam there, the last dam they built on the Columbia up there, we burned all the slash behind that under contract. And I had to go talk to the mayor one day when we'd been burning, and I went to town and they had the street lights on and the headlights going downtown. You talk about smoke. I mean, you could taste it. It was not just smell it, you could taste it. And we did, and that was a prescription we did, with the idea that by removing that, we were putting a lot of nitrogen back in the ground and we could grow. Well, the only thing that I think we finally come to realize that we had all that nitrogen, but the brush took full value of it faster than the tree seedlings could. And it really wasn't. Now, there were other reasons why you could do that, because you could reduce the hazard. And because of, over here on this side of the mountain, they use a term called fuel loading, and that's the amount of debris that would burn or ignite after, and not counting the standing material you get, but the down material. And so this is something you have to take into consideration in the prescriptions that you do. And nowadays, if you look out on some of the what I considered well-managed lands, there are a kaleidoscope of different age classes of trees. And I always, up at the center, every summer, we always get somebody up there and says, well, you guys cut all that trees and you don't plant any. And I say, excuse me, if you look around up here, you can look to Black Mountain, you can turn around and look at Red Mountain, and there are green trees every place. And there's some openings too. But if you get up there, and part of this tour we take, that's one place we always stop to go out. And I can remember my wife now, who helps me up at the center all the time, and she really become something. She grew up in Massachusetts, and I can remember when we first started going together, one day I said, come on, we'll go out and take a road trip and picnic. So we're driving around and we come up and she says, oh my Lord, what's this? And I said, it's clear cut. And she says, oh, how terrible. I said, wait a minute. I said, get out of the truck. So we got out of the truck and she said, what do you want to show me? And I said, trees. She said, well, I don't see any trees, I see lots of stumps. I said, now calm, just take a look around. And she's walking around out through the thing, and finally I said, you just almost stepped on one. She looked, and she still talks about this. She said, I couldn't see a tree, and the minute I saw the first one, then I could see the rest of them. And they were all seedlings like this. They were 1-0 sitting there, and been put in the ground, and there they sat, and they were planted probably about, at that time, about 450 trees the acre. So once you got the spacing, they were all over the place. And from then on, I had a real convert, boy, and she can tell you the story about, yes, people grow trees, you know. And she remembers going out there thinking, and she said it looked like World War I pictures, you know, but she said, yes, the reforestation is there. And it's also, I think that most of us that have been in the business, really that's one of the key features of what we do, is to make sure that we have perpetuated the stand. As things have evolved in our whole thing, we it wasn't too long ago that I attended a session. I happened to be involved with the advisory board of the Whatcom County Forestry Advisory Board for the council. And we were invited to attend this carbon sequestration thing. It was headed up by a county committee, and they had some people from the national office of this thing talking about carbon sequestration, and what I meant was, you know, what's it absorbing? And of course, what we all do is, when you think about it, the trees absorb carbon dioxide and give off oxygen. Most all of us understand that. And so what came out of this, and in this discussion, and it was obvious, but there were 6 of the 8 people involved in the board that were present at this meeting, along with about 20 other individuals that were on this committee that's being formed. And it's a pilot committee for, and Okanagan County is going to be one of them. But, and I thought, and we had some people that I've been related, have interacted with over the years, and I'd put them down in the hard sell category as far as good forest management. And almost to a person in that group, I'm sure there's some skeptics, and since Tom asked me the other night, you know, what was the reaction, and I said, as far as I know, it was really good. But I got a phone call in to check with Josh, because Josh Fleishman is the county planning member that's the advisor to the advisory board, and I wanted to get his take because he went to the rest of the meeting. But when they left, I think they understood. And the point being, and the point we were making, is you grow a tree, okay? You harvest it. In the case of Douglas fir, financial rotation would be 57, 60 years, something like that. We harvest it. But then you put it in a house. That carbon that's in that tree, and what happens, why you take it, when I say a financial, but what it is the species of Douglas fir, it has a growth rate like this. And the minute it gets to be about 60, 70 years old, it drops off. It doesn't quit growing, but it drops off. Really high end. So it's absorbing that carbon. And as it slows down, of course, it doesn't give off that much oxygen. And it also uses less water, but at the same time, in this whole complex situation it's doing, you take it and you put it in boards and you put it in a house, there's another 75 years that you're, or maybe 100 that you're holding on to this carbon. And then, usually, the way we're going at it nowadays, we're recycling a lot of that wood and putting it out, and it might get a second life someplace in the structure. So that is the value. And quite frankly, and I'm not here to talk politics, but we don't need carbon taxes to solve some of these problems. We have to realize what we should be doing is putting our effort to the places where we can store the carbon. You know? And there's more than one area to store carbon, but it makes another talking point for good forest management. I think that's what we have to think about. And this is, I guess, the mission that we've taken on. Started about 24 years ago. A group of us started talking about this, and so we formed Black Mountain Forestry Center, and our mission was to tell the story about what good forest management is. And primarily it's stewardship. That's basically what it really gets down to it. And quite frankly, I always liked this hat. And I happen to be a member, and I've actually taught at some of their sessions, so, and that's Washington Forest Stewardship. And, but also the tree farm, and Whatcom Tree Farmers is another area where we have some really good small landowner things, and they do a good job. We look at some real outstanding jobs of people taking care of their land. And there's an opportunity all the time that if you had an interest or you need something like that, and you have land, you do, and you also, let's talk about the fact that you want to preserve it. How many people would like to not cut a tree or preserve it totally? You know, I find it hard to believe that we're like everything else. I'm finally getting to the age now that I'm realizing that, number one, I got enough scars and stuff to prove it, haven't been out in the woods all the time. So I'm not invincible anymore. But at the same time, I think we have to think about the fact that we need to really push for management of all our lands. We've had some outstanding leadership in the Department of Natural Resources. There was a fellow by the name of Boyle, who I consider to be the outstanding land commissioner that was ever involved with the thing. I happened to be a really good friend, and I really respected him, and we had some state foresters that were really top notch. And then we've come through some cycles where we've not done so well. We just went through a cycle with an individual that was the commissioner, and now we have a new one. I guess we have to see what's going to happen. Well, I think, yes.
Some time ago, years ago, there was a article in the paper about the slide up on Swift Creek, going up on the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
Does the clear cutting that they've done, not right, I can't quite remember, but they've done it close by.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't that affect it? The slide?
In that particular one, there was some influence from the activity, from the harvest activity. Not all. Another one that's very and more recent, but has hit a lot of controversy, is the one, and I couldn't quite believe the governor nor the land commissioner at the time who made the comments they did, and that's at Oso. And that slide there was not caused by harvest activity, logging, nor road construction. That was toe cutting, and the river cut the toe of that slide. Those people have been told for 20 years, don't build in that area because it's a slide area. We have an active program all the time, and I've done it for years. It was called, we went out and we did the PL, preliminary lines. And you go out and you look for access and how it ties all your harvest units together within whatever harvest area you're going to do, and you go out and one of the first things you do is you go around and you look for these areas where you think all of a sudden, in my mind, when you come off the real hard rock and went to the real good dirt, you better start looking around, because you're probably in the wrong place. You better find someplace else to build that road, because you're probably in a slump area.
Where the ice, when the ice age came, they pushed all that stuff against like Sumas Mountain. Half of Sumas Mountain is not hard, is it, Tom? It's all soft, pushed against rock.
Yeah. Now the one in Swift Creek over there, that was on some property. Actually, a German family owns that property.
Oh, okay. I thought it was DNR land up there.
No. And they, over the years, they had a forester there, and he's a local guy. Tom Hansen is his name. And he owned a consulting company, and then he sold out and went to work for American Forests. And they have taken over the management of that land, and some of the reclamation work that they've done on that slide that went into Swift Creek, it's been real beneficial, and it hasn't continued to grow, nor it's still a problem, but now it's really turning green.
I thought I could detect that there was another
It went clear to the ridge, if I remember
Yeah,
right.
almost all
above.
the
Tom, you've been up
above
there.
the green. There's another area that it could be.
I don't
starting to
recall that, but I don't recall much hill above that, because I know they've moved completely away from any harvest right there, because that is a susceptible zone. Well, you had one example. We have another one over on Racehorse that slid down off of that one, and that was not caused by anything plus the fact that, again, that was what I call an unusual weather event, and we had a really heavy snowpack, and then it rained on top of it. And we got a tremendous amount of rain, and of course it turned everything to mush, and the country started to move. And we had a lot of activity off of the Van Dyke, and some off of Stewart Mountain, and some off of Racehorse Creek, and there were several other areas, but it was mostly a weather event where we had rain on snow. That was all, and boy, you have to watch out for that one. You know, the other thing is, I wish she was here, because she also told a story on me that I went back to an area that we'd harvested back in the 1960s, and we were with some old friends and people I'd worked with, and we went up and we decided, let's go look. And so we went and looked at it, and it was on Forest Service land. It happened to be on the Payette National Forest, and I was a logging superintendent for J.I. Morgan there in a little town of New Meadows, Idaho. And we went out on this area we'd harvested, and we looked, and all of a sudden she got a hold of my arm, and she was talking. She looked at me and she said, "Now I know what you mean by it's like going to church." Because these trees, you know, in the 1960s, and this was in 2010, so you had 50, 60 years there, and they were all, and I remember when they socked them in the ground, just like that. They were there, and they're all about 60, 70 feet tall, you know. And she said, "Now I know what you mean by going to church." So, yeah. The other, going down and around, I've got several books here. This one right here, where I've got the blue marker, and it shows the right-of-way outline of where the Bellingham Bay in British Columbia came from Bellingham and went to Sumas, and you can see how it came through Everson. I'll pass that around. That blue marker marks the map. This one.
Oh, yeah. Been selling for a while.
This one here is mainly by the Columbia Valley, and when they were logging up there, and this is where I was telling you about where they set the record on this thing. And the real thing is
Bill, you mentioned one thing about Columbia Valley. You mentioned that they had a big mill at Cultus Lake.
well, north of Cultus, yeah.
North of Cultus.
And
And
then
they
that
pulled
one-
all of the wood in the United States and took it into Canada
Well,
and
well,
milled it up there.
they probably took some, but not a lot. Where it mostly come was right out of that valley there.
Yeah.
And that was the name of it, and I didn't have it that day, but I got it here now. The Campbell River Timber Company, and their mill was north of Cultus Lake, where you come around, where the road comes around and comes off that river there and comes up to the lake. There was a big mill there, and that was the Columbia.
But it was easier to run it down the valley than it was
Well, they were taking it that way, and that's where they were logging. I don't think they. I don't
You
know.
worry
The
about the-
railroad went around the north end of, or the east side of Silver Lake. Goes up. I've got another book, and I don't believe I bought it. It shows the railroads, shows all the right-of-ways of the railroads in Whatcom County. Maybe it's in that book there. But anyway, I'll pass that around. And the center up there, I really encourage you to come up, because you can have a pretty good time. We got a sawmill up there, and we used to run it, but State Industrial shut us down. And we used to demonstrate splitting shakes. We had to shut that down, except we got a hand throw up there. We can let you muscle them out if you want. And deposits and displays all around. And the house, the Gerdrum House, and it's unique. It was built out of one cedar tree in 1893. And that home is still there.
and those logs were sawed by the old sawmill.
And well, they were sawed by hand with a drop saw, with a pit saw.
That was
one
the old
sawdust.
sawmill.
Yeah, and you can still see the marks in them. and the dovetail on the building is just, the craftsmanship is just outstanding. And that house is still there. Tom Nelson, who used to be the general manager for Sierra Pacific, said, and they really made a big contribution because their window company come up with the wherewithal that we got all brand new windows in that house. And he made the point that the big double window upstairs was probably worth more than the house was when it was built. Just that double set of windows. But they put the windows in there, and we had to change the foundation. And when you come up, always look at the base logs, because they're not old growth cedar. You can see the knots and everything else. We tried like heck to find a match, but we couldn't do it to bring it started up. But we didn't. We probably didn't spend enough time. We had summertime. We had to get it done. So, but that house is real unique, you know. The whole area. We started an arboretum up there, and over the years we keep losing volunteers, and the rest of the volunteers are not getting any younger. But and we haven't done a lot of expansion lately. We had trouble with the deer, so we planted some Gary oak again for the third time, and I'm going to try birch again, see if I can't get one big enough and then keep the deer away from that. And
you are willing to take new volunteers, though, aren't you?
oh yes, we're always looking for volunteers if anybody's interested. And
so some of the younger people, and maybe some of the kids out of school, and
well, we've had I think right now we stand at about 7 Eagle Scout projects that have been taken care of there on the site, and which we've come a long way in meeting our goal, and people walking away with understanding that no, we're just not all tree killers. You know, there is just something to be said about good management of land. You know, the other thing that's interesting, when we got saddled with the Northwest Forest Plan, it caused some severe economic hardship to a lot of people. And we were 8 years from completing what Congress set forth in 1928 as a declining yield rotation. In other words, to make sure that we had young growing forests, we'd take the old growth and we'd reduce it, and then we'd have all young growing forest, and that's where we came up with. It would have been the allowable cut of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie would have come from about 205 million, pretty close, down to about, I think it was 102 or something like that, on the basis of what the modern day requirements of that. And we would have an age class distribution throughout what we call a working circle, which includes an area, a working area that would, how you calculate, and what that is too, what it relates to. And I don't want to, but we have what we call an annual allowable cut. And that volume is determined by how much it grows in any given period of time. So you're not reducing your growing stock, you're just replacing it. And that's a real simple explanation of it, but it's a lot more complicated than that. But there's other things. In the other type of rotation, you have all aged, and your entry for harvest is reduced by usually a division of the rotation age. Like in the case of East Side, some of the stuff over on the ranch, we're managing on 100 years. And so we have 4 harvest entries, one every 25 years. But then there's salvage and sanitation cutting and some commercial thinning that's involved in between that, but it's not harvest. You see, that's the difference in it. But then you're creating all these different age classes. Whereas over here, where we need the sun and everything else, we have even aged, and we have these blocks, and therefore you define those acres by how you get age class distribution. And now back to Swift Creek, one of the goals up there by the German family that invested in that, Tom spent years working at getting age class distribution in that. And they were starting to show. Now they've increased the harvest up there by quite a bit. And they also bought some property on the other side of the hill over on Stewart Mountain. And that was when Sierra Pacific bought out Crown Pacific, or assumed their indebtedness, and I always called, they had a general manager, he was a real sharp cookie and a good man, and he always used to say that was their debt reduction rotation. They had an extreme amount of debt, and they used that, and he called it, that's what he called it, and he was managing the land, and his name was Russ Paul, and he was a good forester, sharp too, but that is a different approach to the thing. And what we're trying to do is say, this is what we promote, and this is what we want people to understand of what it's all about. And we're bound to have annually, for a while, environmental studies down there, the environmental Huxley College, we had an annual trip. They'd bring their well, actually, they had a forester, a professor of forestry. He's now the dean of forestry at Michigan State University, but he was teaching here. His name was Paul Truxell, and he was here. And every year he'd bring the class up, and we'd have a get together up at the center, and we'd talk about preservation and environmental impacts and everything like that, and a lively discussion. Paul, he was a little different. He said, Phil, I want you to know that the score after 8 years was Black Mountain Forestry Center 8, and Truxley class was 0. But he said, the one thing about it, you got a few years on those kids that you were picking on. So.
Are you allowed to cut the burn kill or beetle kill trees?
No.
What's going to happen to them?
They're going to turn into fuel.
For another fire?
Well, though we're very lucky, and so far, but I think what we really need to say is, let's take a hard look at this, and let's not be dancing around the rosemary bush about we'll have thinnings. Let's go out and say, we've got an allowable cut, we're going to harvest, we're going to manage the land. It goes to other things. I don't know what you thought about when they had a big bunch of hearings on road closures up on this part of the forest, on what is now the Cedar Woolley district, which used to be the Glacier Ranger district. And they're going to close all the roads. Well, the reason they don't have any money is because logging operations, we used to maintain the roads, because that was part of the timber sale contract.
These would be the logging roads that are running through there?
Well, those were the systems that were developed. And sometimes they were pretty high standards. We built double lane roads that were there, and you don't need a double lane road to haul logs down. It was SL 14, you know. The other thing is, I always have real strong feelings. I don't like side cast road. In other words, you throw the debris over the side. I like full bench, and you roll the grade, and you balance your cuts and fills so you can bring it all up, and you build the road right into the mountain. And out here, about the only place you see side cast is where you set your tower settings, your landings. And you'll notice a lot of times in the fall, you look up there and they're burning the slash on the landing. That's to reduce the weight of that material that was left. That's why they burn it off there. They're taking it off there like that. And then that gets on to the other thing we have to talk about. It's a mixed a discussion, and we're going to have, when is it, Tom? May the 19th? 18th. At the East Whatcom Regional Resource Center up in Kendall, along the Kendall Road there. The big building that sits back off the road if you've been up there. We're going to have what did you finally decide what we're going to call it?
Yeah, it's fire hazard reduction.
Okay,
seminar.
fire hazard reduction symposium or talk, and there'll be some stuff, and if you got some land, it'd probably be worthwhile taking a look at it, give you some ideas. We got one of the spin-offs of that, I think we'll see what happens next week, but we're trying to get Clean Air to put some money into financing some chippers up there in the Columbia Valley that will just go out, because we've got a lot of storm damage. Every place there's a lot of storm damage. And of course, within that unincorporated UGA, no burning. And you can't haul, I was telling Jim, you can't haul that material to some place where you can burn it. That's against the law too. If you get caught, I guess. But sometimes, I don't know. And the other thing everybody should be aware of, especially when it comes to some of these laws, look real hard. We're going to go through this with water now that we didn't meet that plan for the watershed. That Department of Ecology now has taken over because of the rulemaking authority. And what we have, and we need to talk to our legislators about, is, have you ever wondered what that law looks like? And then when you see the administrative rules that are created from that law, there are a lot of latitude being taken in the creation of those rules under the original intent of the law. I'm not a lawyer, and I didn't want to be either. So, but at the same time, I've always hired them because I needed them. But I think everybody needs to take a look at that, because we do create a lot of rules that don't quite follow the intent of the law. And that's, I think, what we have to do. Any more questions or comments? Or
That's a good note to end on.
yep. I'm about to talk myself out, and I probably talked your ear off. So,
Good job.
but I sure appreciate you coming. Thank you. And if you too can, please come on up. You can come and you can spend as much time as you want. Donations are appreciated. That's about all that's there.